triggers for organ donation especially, and then also if they have somebody who could potentially be a tissue donor. And we'll talk a little bit about how those things are different and how that plays out a little bit differently. But another large part of what we do, in addition to facilitating organ and tissue donation, is we manage the Michigan Organ Donor Registry with the Secretary of State here in Michigan. How many of you guys, like if you've been into the Secretary of State, you know, to get a license, an ID, do you remember being asked if you wanted to join the Michigan Organ Donor Registry? Yeah, so we do that in partnership with them. And the registry, we'll talk a little bit more too, but it's basically, it's a confidential database that houses the names of everybody that wants to donate their organs and tissues in Michigan after they pass away. It's, you know, I kind of always like to think of it kind of like a will for your organs and tissues. When you can no longer speak for yourself, you've at least had a way to document that, legally document that before you pass away, that this is something you would want to do to help somebody else. So that's why that registry exists. And I would say 95% of people join the Organ Donor Registry through the Secretary of State. And then I'm happen to be here from West Michigan too. I live in Byron Center, but Gift of Life is actually located over in Ann Arbor. And if you ever get the chance to take a tour, I highly recommend it. It's very interesting to see our facility there and our clinical operations. Have you? It's relatively new, yeah. Have you ever had a chance to? We got to get you there for a tour. So we actually are one of the fewer OPOs in the U.S. that has the ability to do everything on site for organ donation and transplantation to occur. So we have a pretty state-of-the-art surgical center. There is a 3-bed ICU there, and we have 4 operating rooms. So I would say about 40% of organ donors are transferred over to Gift of Life to have their organs recovered, and about 99% of tissue donors are transferred there for tissue recoveries. And then we have a full-service lab. As you can probably imagine, there's a lot of blood work that has to happen for donation to take place, right? To make sure that a donor is going to be a compatible match with a recipient, that it's safe, these organs being donated. So, you know, we test for infectious diseases, and we have to do a lot of blood typing and tissue typing, and I'll talk about that in just a little bit. You can go to the next slide, please. And hopefully this will cooperate with me. It's a little video. Do we think the video will work? Okay, I'm gonna step out of the way. This is just a short video, you guys. If you go back one, usually, if you click on it, it should load it. This little video outlines the organ donation process and kind of our role as an OPO in that process, if it wants to play. If not, that's okay. I don't know if it helps if we, if I exit out of this, would that be too hard to pull it back up? No. If you can go to YouTube if you want. If it's too much work, it's okay too. We don't have to show it.
Live or anything?
No pressure.
All right, speakers on. What do you mean?
On the wall. Turn it on the wall.
Of thousands every day. The intricate journey begins with the generosity of one person, the organ donor.
That's good.
Organ donors are hospitalized patients on ventilators whose brains or hearts have stopped functioning, often due to a tragic injury. But the organs are still viable. After exhausting all means to save the patient's life, the hospital contacts their Organ Procurement Organization, or OPO. OPO staff are trained to counsel patients' families at the worst moment of their lives. If the patient is a registered organ donor, the OPO helps the family understand the process they're about to go through. If the patient is not registered, the OPO offers the family the option to donate. This is a transformative decision. A single donor can save up to 8 lives. Eye and tissue donors can heal even more.
Give it time.
Once authorization is obtained, the
Give it
OPO
time.
begins working to match the organ with a critically ill
This is
patient.
so common. Yeah, we
Currently, more than 100,000 patients are on the national waiting list, maintained by the United Network for Organ Sharing, or UNOS. OPO staff first determine if the donor's organs are viable for transplant, and then enters their medical information into the UNOS database, which generates a list of best matches based on a variety of clinical factors. The OPO contacts the transplant hospitals of matched patients, where doctors will determine if the donated organ is right for their patient. Once an organ has been accepted, the clock starts ticking, because organs remain viable outside the body for only a short time. The organs are then respectfully recovered from the generous donor. The OPO arranges to transport the donated organ to the transplant hospital to help a patient in need. Once the medical team transplants the organ, a life is saved. A donor, a willing family, and life-saving organs are essential to the transplant journey. It takes place 24 hours a day, 365 days a year.
All right, thank you. Thanks for making that work, bearing with us with our slight little technical difficulty there. So I'll give you just a second to, there we go, awesome. So why are we here, right? We've kind of alluded to this a little bit. Why is donation important? I think you guys have a beautiful example of why organ donation is important, how transformative it is here in Mr. Chris, right? You're lucky enough to know somebody whose life has been directly impacted, and somebody who's here today because somebody made the decision to be an organ donor. So when we talk about the donor registry, it covers organ, tissue, and cornea donation. So all three of those things, and they all make a huge impact in people's lives. So when we talk about organ donation, we view it as like life-saving. Tissue donation, that is more like life-enhancing, life-improving. It improves people's quality of life, their mobility, and in some cases it can be life-saving as well. But because of organ donors, 90 lives are saved every single day. People that are waiting for life-saving organ transplants, people like Mr. Chris. And tissue donation, has anybody in this room had a tissue transplant that you know of? It's super common. Tissue is used a lot, like in sports injuries, dentistry, podiatry, like if you've ever had a dental implant. People like get their ACL repaired or replaced, their tissue is used for that. So it's very common. So tissue transplants and tissue donation, that's gonna happen far more often than organ donation and transplantation. And then cornea transplants restore sight. Are you guys all familiar with what the cornea is, like how it refers to the eye donation piece? We'll talk about each of these in a little bit more detail as we go on. But I mean, imagine losing your sight. Some people have corneal blindness because they have an inherited condition. Some people just have an accident where they scratch their eye and it causes them to lose their sight. Because of a cornea donor, you can easily have your sight restored in a very, very simple procedure. Not everybody's going to have that luxury if they have some other type of blindness. But again, cornea transplants are an amazing gift to be able to give to somebody as well. So before we kind of start out talking about organ donation and organ transplants and with the waiting list, I asked Mr. Chris if he would share a little bit more with you guys about his story, his journey, and what it was like to have a transplant. So if you don't mind talking a little bit about that right now, that would be wonderful.
For me, as she's talking, it brings back a lot of the steps in the process. And I have to be honest, this has stirred up these past few weeks have stirred up a lot of old memories, some painful, some not so much. But when she's talking about finding a donor, for a liver, it's based on what they call a MELD score, which is a composite of test scores and such, which ultimately, the higher the MELD score, the higher on the list you are for a liver. And for me, in the 6 months prior to getting on the list, my MELD score had went from a 12 to a 25, right? Which doesn't really have a big frame of reference, but In terms of getting sicker fast, that's what happened, right? Once the liver was starting to go pretty fast. I was on the transplant list for 3 months, and I got the call 3 days before. Literally, I was at work, and I got the phone call from the hospital saying that they had a liver. So the process of them saying, hey, we've got a donor, find, you know, do you have a patient that can take it, that meet the metrics? The person was a young woman. She was in some form of an accident, and that's all I know. I'm going to make the assumption that she was brain dead or something along those lines, where the body was just, they kept it in preservation until they could harvest the organs. I ended up driving down to Ann Arbor that evening. It was a snowy night, and the next morning surgery began. I was in surgery for about 11 and a half hours. One of the transplant team was actually able to go over and harvest the liver, and which ended up being a benefit for me because they knew my anatomy, they knew what I needed, so they were able to take extra bile duct and such so that they didn't have to do any reconstruction, which is one of the major complications of liver disease, liver transplantation. I was 5 days in the hospital, and after a little bit of medicine adjustment, I had to go back in for a couple of days. 3 months of recovery from basically from the physical injury, and then I was back to work. I was back to work March, I think it was, yeah, mid-March. I was back at work. One of the things the Gift of Life did was afterwards they asked about trying to connect me to the donor family. And it's a very discreet process. They sent me an envelope with a note, basically, so that I could write to them the instructions on what to write, because they have great experience as to how donor families will respond. And I was just telling Allison, I said, 6.5 years, I never have had a response. And I wrote it I wrote the fall after my transplant, and then I also wrote again at my 5-year anniversary. So, you know, when you go through an experience like this, you're transformed. You truly are. The person that you guys have all experienced today is probably a more wiser person than from 5-6 years ago. It's one thing to go to the point of death, but it's another thing to have this opportunity to be able to help others, to be able to come back and help others. Think of how I, you know, good or bad, think about how I've touched you, all of you in this class, you know, and just by their daily interactions, right? And I've been able to see my 3 youngest kids graduate from high school. I'll see my son graduate from college. I've experienced other life events too, and I would never have been able to do any of that. Literally, I probably would have been dead by March if I hadn't had the transplant. So it was, like I said, it's transformative. It humbles you, and it makes you feel, it puts you in a place that is not as large as you may think you are. So, but that's my story, and it's kind of simple. Look, I'm fortunate that it has a happy ending. You know, so.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I really appreciate it. I mean, it's one thing for us to listen to you tell it, like it's a story to us. That's your life, right? You lived that. And I can't imagine what it is like to be so near death and to go like just through all the emotions and everything that comes along with it. And then, like you said, just this transformation that happens when you get a transplant, and then everything that comes along with that,
Sure.
right?
Yeah,
so
I planned it to be my last Christmas. So I bought heirloom gifts for all the kids.
Oh, wow.
When I got the call, I did all my paperwork so I could leave work, and I had met all my kids and gave them all their presents, and then went down to Ann Arbor, right? And then the next Christmas, you know, we were talking about, you know, what we were going to do, and I said, well, you guys got to realize the gifts aren't going to be quite as meaningful as last year, right? You got this heirloom gift last year. You're probably going to get a sweater this year.
You're the gift,
right? So, but you know, the one thing that we do, and I think because we've never talked to the donor family, is that, you know, when we have holidays, when we have family gatherings, we, in our prayers, in saying grace, we say something about the empty table, because we realize, and this is probably the most humbling thing for me,
Mm-hmm.
is that I am there, but the donor family doesn't have that person. It's an empty chair.
I was gonna say, oh,
And
that's what I was looking for.
And excuse me.
Thanks.
And I think that's the most humbling thing. You know, that, you know, they have that empty chair. And, you know, anytime you can make that emptiness worthwhile, I think it's worth it. So.
Yep, absolutely.
Pass it back.
Yep, thank you. Thank you. No, I mean, thank you for sharing that with us. And I think you're doing a tremendous job of honoring that person, right? And making that family proud. And yeah, it's just an amazing gift, right? That somebody gives to help somebody else. I really appreciate you sharing your story with us. So, you know, Mr. Chris, you mentioned you were one of the lucky ones that got a transplant. There are a lot of people that don't get one, and we'll talk about that. The need for life-saving organ transplants is a national health crisis. There are so many people, like Mr. Chris, you know, find themselves on the waiting list for an organ, and most people will get one, but not everybody does, because there's way more people waiting than we have organs available. And we'll talk too in a second about why that is. But what I want you guys to do right now is just take a look up here. This is in Michigan, this is our waiting list. These numbers come out at the beginning of each month. So you can see, you know, the different organs that people are waiting for. And, you know, you can see some people need multiple. Those lines where there are multiple organs listed, those people are waiting for all of those organs. So it's hard enough to wait for one. Now imagine you're waiting for multiples. When you guys look at this list, does anything stand out to you? Kidneys. Yeah. I mean, it is way above the other organs. It's a little over 80% of the waiting list. Why do you guys suppose that is? What kind of things might make so many people need a kidney transplant? Alcohol is a great guess. It's usually the #1 answer I get when I ask this question. That's going to affect your liver more so. Did you say kidney disease? Did somebody say kidney disease? Or? Oh, diabetes. Yes, bingo. Diabetes and high blood pressure. So many people have problems with that, right? These are very common chronic conditions. Kidney disease in general is a huge problem, right? If diabetes and high blood pressure get bad enough, it will cause your kidneys to fail. Those are the leading causes of kidney failure. So that right there is why you see such a high number of people in need of a kidney. And if you want to click for me, it's going to bring up some stats. So in the United States, so back to Michigan, we have a little over 2,400 people on the waiting list. In the US, there are 106,000 people waiting, and I have this stat in here. I kept it on here. I usually talk to high school students a lot. So, but just to let you guys know, this doesn't just affect people who are older. This affects babies, children, teenagers, college students. You know, people at every age are affected by the need for a life-saving organ transplant. To kind of put it into perspective, so there are 106,000 people waiting right now. Last year was a record year for organ donation. Living donors and deceased donors combined resulted in about 40,000 organ transplants, the most ever in the US. At the most ever, we don't even come close to meeting the need of about 106,000 people that are waiting. Every 10 minutes, a new name gets added to the waiting list. So by the time we're done here this morning, easily 4 or 5 people will have been placed on the waiting list for a transplant. That is a real statistic. And unfortunately, you know, we talked about how 90 lives are saved every day. There's still about 20 people on average that die every day waiting for an organ transplant. Again, because they're just not readily available. You can go ahead to the next slide, please. So why is that? Why is this such a problem? Really, a lot of it falls on the fact that organ donation is incredibly rare. Just what has to happen medically for it to be possible, only about 1 to 2% of the population is going to meet the criteria for that. That's it. So In order to be an organ donor, a person has to be on a ventilator in a hospital when they pass away. I'm guessing you all know what a ventilator is, what it does. Yeah, you know, so these are very tragic circumstances. Typically, somebody who's suffered some sort of traumatic brain injury or loss of oxygen to the brain that has resulted in that person needing to be placed on a ventilator in a hospital. Ventilator is really the critical piece to organ donation being possible because, as you know, the ventilator helps you breathe. So it can mechanically support someone's breathing and heart function even after they pass away. So most people, as you were saying, that become organ donors have been declared brain dead. And that is a legal declaration of death. It's not like being in a coma. It's a complete and irreversible loss of brain function. There's multiple tests done to make this diagnosis by multiple physicians at different times, right? So usually in those cases, individuals, if you know they meet this other criteria here, if they don't have certain infectious diseases and they're in general good health, their organs are healthy, they can be transplanted to save a life. So that's kind of how that works. So just kind of give you some background. Remember, this is just, it's very rare that somebody has the ability to do this. Just because you join the organ donor registry does not mean you're going to be able to donate your organs someday. Only if you are on a ventilator when you pass away. So you can see why we just don't have organs readily available. So, okay, now you guys know just how rare this is. We've got this very precious resource. There's not much of it to go around, and there's tons of people waiting. So how in the world do we decide who's going to get an organ, right? I can tell you it is blind. It's not like you write an essay about why you're so worthy of getting an organ over somebody else. You know what I mean? It doesn't work like that. Or like who the hospital or, you know, we at Gift of Life think is, you know, deemed appropriate to receive an organ. We actually at Gift of Life don't have any say in who gets an organ. We make them available, and a transplant center would accept an organ on behalf of their patient. But what I can tell you for sure is it's all based on medical compatibility, and that's it. So how it works, in that video we just watched, you saw an organization called UNOS, United Network for Organ Sharing. This is the organization that oversees the national waiting list. Don't think of it really like a true list. You could be moving up and down in your status for a transplant based on how sick you are. I'm sure you can explain it. You know, it's not like a cut and dried process. And the criteria is a little bit different for each organ. With livers, we are looking at the model for end-stage liver disease, the MELD score. So the sicker you are, that's going to put you at top status to receive a liver and really any organ. When we talk about transplants, we're very concerned with somebody's severity of illness. But before I get into this real quick, I just kind of want to explain. So how it works, when Mr. Chris went to U of M, right, to be listed for transplant, I'm sure you can attest to the fact that there's a lot of stuff you have to do to get on the waiting list. You have to, you know, medically speaking. And so what happens is his team at U of M, they're going to put all of his medical information, his blood type, his height, his size, like all the really important criteria that we need to make sure a donor is going to be a suitable match for him. That goes in this UNOS database. And the database houses everybody who's waiting for an organ, all that information for them. What we do at Gift of Life, we take all that medical information we have about the donor, you know, based on medical records, interviews with family members, just what we know from the hospital, the tests that have been done. We enter that data into the database as well. And the database kind of gets to work crunching numbers. There's point values assigned to these things. And it'll say, you know, based especially particularly on the things you see listed here, and again, it's a little bit different for each organ, these 4 people are the most medically suitable match for this organ, right? And then so we would let the transplant centers know, and then it's sort of figured out from there. They sort of figure out who's going to be the best candidate, and then maybe we'll accept the offer for an organ. So blood type has to be a match between donor and recipient. That's critical, just like with blood donation. Same thing here. Tissue typing is also like critical when we do organ transplants. This refers to something called human leukocyte antigen, or cross-matching. Some of you are shaking your heads like you've heard of this. So HLA markers, right, on the blood. That's a protein we have in our cells. It's kind of responsible for regulating the immune system. In essence, helping your body know like what belongs here, what doesn't, right? And so What doesn't belong? A virus, a cold, you know, how your immune system fires up when you get sick. Well, it views a foreign organ as the same thing. It's going to try to kill that because it doesn't have the same DNA as you. So we have to really look closely at the HLA markers on the donor and the recipient to see if they're going to be a compatible match, so that we can minimize the level of rejection that someone might face when they get a new organ, because your body's always going to try to attack it if it didn't belong to you, but we can minimize how aggressively it will attack that organ. And then size is really important. You know, I like to give this example. Let's say each of you are on the waiting list for a heart transplant right now. Do you want it to come from a baby? No, right? It's not big enough or strong enough to pump blood in your body. And then vice versa, do you want it to come from somebody who's like 3 times your size? No, it's too big. It's not going to fit inside your body. So that is considered very closely when we talk about doing organ transplants. And then of course, distance from the donor hospital. So these organs are only viable outside of the body for a certain period of time, right, without a blood supply. So we're limited to how far we can travel in that amount of time. And then the number of days somebody spends waiting is considered. The amount of time that you waited, what's the average for a liver? Do you remember?
It was about 6 months.
Okay, yeah,
And
yeah.
And it was kind of weird that I got the call at 3.
Yeah,
Luckily.
blessed to get a call sooner than that. So yeah, they'll kind of add that into the equation. And then one other thing I just wanted to point out when we talk about pediatric transplants, so when children need a transplant, it needs to come an organ from a child usually because of size, right? So whenever there is a pediatric donor, a pediatric recipient's going to get top status for that. It's always going to go to another child before it would ever go to an adult. So that's kind of what's looked at for every single organ. All right, help me out here, you guys. I want to review what are the organs you can donate for transplant. And maybe you can read this from where you're sitting, maybe not. But let's just quickly review them. Just shout them out with me. Heart, lungs, liver, we know that, right? Kidney, pancreas. Corneas are a tissue. I think there's one more we haven't said. Yes, the small intestine or small bowel. So we just listed off 6 things, but you can actually save 8 lives as an organ donor. I would try to make a case for the fact that you could save 9 because the liver from a deceased donor can be split and it can go to 2 people. So how do we get there? Like, okay, you've got these 6 organs. How is it possible that we can actually save 8 lives?
We have 2 kidneys.
2 kidneys and 2 lungs. So how it works with deceased kidney donation, your kidneys will be recovered together, but they go to separate people, right? They save 2 lives. And a single lung can save a life. Some people just need a single lung transplant to live. Yes, question?
What is the smallest amount of the liver? Like 20% can go to save another person?
I want to say it's around 30%.
Yeah, about a third.
A third, yeah.
'Cause
Yep.
We had actually looked at living donor also.
Yeah, a very small piece of the liver can regrow back to the size that it's supposed to be. So living liver donation is, yes, another way that somebody who needs a liver transplant can be helped. So you've got deceased liver donation and living liver donation, just like you do with kidneys. You hear about that a lot for kidneys. But yes, the liver is the only human organ that completely regrows. So we have the ability to do that. Typically, your liver has 2 lobes. You'd probably donate the smaller lobe, and then the remaining lobe in your body will grow back to the size that you need to be healthy and function, and then the lobe that you donate will do the same thing in the recipient. Have you guys ever heard how long it takes to grow back? You may correct me on this. I've kind of done a little bit of research on this. I kind of see numbers all across the board, but what I see usually is like by 2 weeks it grows back enough to function properly.
30 to 45 days.
Yeah. And then, it could take up to a year to be back to its physical size. Some people it's sooner than that. I've seen 6 months. So it really is pretty fascinating. It's amazing how it does that. It's the only human organ that really has the capability to do that. It'd be great if they all could do that, right? And then you could have living donation for every single organ, but unfortunately it doesn't work that way. All right. So another thing that I want to point out is how organ donation really affects multicultural communities. The big problem is that people from multicultural communities, specifically like African American, Latinx communities, are more likely to need organs, especially kidneys. There are higher rates of high blood pressure and diabetes in these communities, which we know now what leads to kidney failure. About 40% of people waiting for kidneys are African American. And we do interracial transplants all the time. I mean, that can certainly be done. But particularly when we talk about kidneys, or really any organ, we're all more likely to find our best match from somebody who has the same ethnic background as we do. We're just gonna have more similar compatibility with our genetics and stuff like that, right? But with kidneys, that HLA marker that I was talking about, that doesn't always play nice when we talk about kidney transplants. So say a Caucasian's HLA markers, not always very compatible with an African American's HLA markers, which makes it so that African Americans sometimes have to wait longer for kidney transplants, or may have to take one that's not the best possible match for them. Because what happens is we have overrepresentation of multicultural communities on the waiting list, waiting for organs, underrepresentation in the donor pool, right? So in any community, if you don't have enough people that share your ethnic background, you're gonna be waiting longer to find the best possible match for you. So if that makes sense, there's a great need for more donors from multicultural communities. Oh, and I forgot I have this living donation slide. No, you're good, you can go ahead, thank you. So we kind of just covered this. With kidneys, you know, if you have 2 healthy kidneys, you can get by just fine with 1. And again, we're lucky we have living kidney donation because so many people are waiting for kidney transplants. Are you guys familiar with dialysis or heard of it? So yeah, when you're in end-stage renal failure, you have to go on dialysis. You can't survive without it. You know, your kidneys produce urine, so they're filtering waste and fluid out of your bloodstream. When they fail, they're no longer doing that, right? So that's now all just building up inside your body. You can't live like that. So a lot of people are on dialysis. You know, usually go to a center 3 days a week, 4 hours at a time. Your blood's actually taken out of your body, put through the dialysis machine, it's filtered, the fluid is pulled off, and then it's put back in your body. Miserable for people that have to do it. It's so hard on the body, but we're lucky we have it. It keeps people alive while they wait for a kidney transplant. And then of course a kidney transplant would take you off of dialysis. But in Michigan, our average wait time for a kidney from a deceased donor is like 5 to 7 years. Some people wait like 10. So we're not talking about a short window of time. So if you're lucky enough to get a living donor, it can really shorten the amount of time, maybe to like a year, that you'd have to wait for a kidney transplant. So we just talked about the liver, it regrows. So this isn't as common as living kidney donation. It's becoming a little bit more of, I don't want to say popular, but it's being done more often, a little bit as people learn about this option. And then you could potentially donate a lobe of your lung. This is incredibly rare. It's not done very much at all. The one thing I do like to point out about living donation, this is an amazing way to save lives as well, help people on the waiting list. It's not covered on the organ donor registry. So if this is like something you feel compelled to do to help somebody, you don't need to know who you're donating to. A lot of times you hear about people doing it for a family member or a friend. You do have to be 18 to be a living donor. And you would work with a transplant center like U of M, or here in Grand Rapids, Mercy Health, St. Mary's does adult kidney transplants, and they do pediatric kidney transplants at Helen DeVos Children's Hospital. So you would just work with them. They would walk you through that process. Any questions about organ donation before I kind of switch to talk a little bit more about the tissues? Okay, so tissue donation, as I was saying in the beginning, this is considered to be life-enhancing, life-improving. Tissue donors heal through all the gifts that they're able to give. It's so common that tissue transplants take place for a variety of reasons. As you can see up here, the big one, like tendons and ligaments, would be used for sports injuries. You can probably attest to the dental procedure piece. That is donor tissue, oftentimes bone, that's used for those dental implants, things like that. So very, very common. The key difference between organ and tissue donation is that you actually don't have to pass away in a hospital to be a tissue donor. So we have about 24 hours after somebody passes away that tissues can be recovered to help somebody. And as you can imagine, that gives people the opportunity to be tissue donors far more often than organ donation. You can go ahead. And again, so many ways that tissues can be used. One person on average ends up helping at least 75 people. So you can see here, when we refer to tissues, what are we talking about, right? Like, what can you donate? So things like your ribs and costal cartilage would be used for people who've had severe trauma to their face or an accident that requires facial reconstruction. Bone, there's so many ways bone can be used. Like, they can make bone into screws for surgeries and different shapes to be used, and it will like fuse right into your existing bone and heal really great. Then you don't have like a synthetic substance or hardware stuck in your body for the rest of your life. Yeah.
So if you die and you're an organ donor, all of this stuff, they're taking all of this out your body?
Great question. So the organ donor registry, yes, it covers organ, tissues, and cornea donation. They may not take like all of it. I mean, it would have to be suitable to be donated. They would evaluate that at the time of your death. But yes, this is what the organ donor registry applies to. Now, if you want to join the registry and you would rather not donate your tissues, but you want to donate your organs, you're not given the opportunity to designate that when you sign up. It's just a yes or no answer. But what you can do is just write out or type out a note of what you would want donated, what you don't want donated, date it and sign it. You can keep it on you or give it to somebody who would make those important decisions for you. That is legally binding and would be honored. So yeah, unfortunately you can't designate when you sign up, but you just got to go that route of writing it down and sign and date it, and that will be honored. Yep, so your tendons and ligaments, your corneas, as we were talking about, restore sight. Bone is often used to prevent people from having their limbs amputated. When people have bone cancer, you're facing amputation, basically. That bone has to come out. So we would typically replace cancerous bone with long bones from the leg. And skin, you probably heard about, used for burn victims, can be life-saving, used for hernia repair after someone's had a mastectomy. The skin's used for reconstructive surgery. And your veins can be donated to help people, especially like on dialysis, those access points. Sometimes, just have to be fixed with veins from a donor, because those veins in the person on dialysis, they start to collapse after so much of your blood being filtered and going in and out of your body. And then nerves, which you guys, is probably hard for you to see, but up here there's a picture of Lily. She was actually 2 years old when she was in a four-wheeler accident while her mom was in labor, if you can imagine. Like, I don't know who was supposed to be watching her that day, but talk about two crazy things going on, right? So she fell off of a four-wheeler and severed her hand. And there was a surgeon in Michigan who was like, I think we can save this hand. And a large part of what they did was they used nerves from a donor to reattach it. And now it looks a little different. Obviously, it doesn't function quite as well as the other one, but she has use of two hands now as opposed to only having one hand after an accident like that. So many ways that these tissues can be used to improve people's quality of life that we just don't really think about, right? So cornea donation. Corneas are a tissue, but cornea donation is facilitated by eye banks, and in Michigan, our eye bank is Eversight. So we work very closely with them at Gift of Life to manage the cornea donation process. Eversight would be responsible for recovering the corneas from a donor. The cool thing about corneas is that pretty much anybody can be a donor. They are avascular, right? So there's no blood vessels that go to them. So we don't worry about blood typing, tissue typing. You can have a history of cancer and still donate. And you can even have bad vision and still donate your corneas. Like, if your vision loss is not caused by corneal blindness of some sort and your cornea is healthy, it can be donated to restore somebody's sight. So because corneas can be preserved for up to 14 days after they're recovered, they're pretty much readily available, right? So if you need a cornea transplant, you can easily get one. It's an outpatient procedure. And what I'm going to show you next, first I want to just sorry, if you don't mind going back, I got ahead of myself there. 2 reasons you might need a cornea transplant. Taylor here, she had like an internal condition that caused her corneas to cloud over. It was like a condition she was born with. She's had to have 2 cornea transplants, but she's had her sight restored. And if she needs another one, she can get one. Or you may experience external cornea damage. Any one of us are probably at risk for that, right? So whether you get scratched in the eye by someone, or in Colton's case up here, he was actually out fishing with his brother, and his brother went to cast, and the hook ended up in his eye. I know, right? It's really not nice to think about. But the accidents happen, as I'm sure you will all come across in your careers. And luckily, in the case of something like this, a cornea transplant can very easily restore your sight because of the generous gift of cornea donors. So I would say corneas are the most donated, most transplanted of organs and tissues, most commonly done. And just to show you guys an example. So this is actually, this one on the left is an internal condition called Fuchs dystrophy, one of the common reasons that somebody would need a cornea transplant. It kind of causes the cells in the cornea to become cloudy, which causes the vision loss. And again, your cornea, think of it like a contact lens, right in front of your iris and pupil, very clear layer of tissue on the top of the eye. And it keeps dust and dirt out. It can also help you focus on things. What would happen is a healthy cornea would be recovered from a donor, and it's sewn on the recipient, as you see here. And I don't know if you can see around me, but those stitches are finer than a human hair. It's really cool how they can do that. And they eventually dissolve, and in a matter of days, your sight's like completely restored once your eyes adjust. Any questions on any of that? Yes?
So if a person needs a cornea transplant and they had, like, from a donor who had eye problems, will that person now have those same eye problems?
Nope. So if the donor had eye problems, but it didn't affect their cornea, if their cornea is healthy, that can be donated to help somebody who has corneal blindness and needs a cornea transplant. Yeah, and that's one of the things about the cornea is it doesn't have blood vessels, so it doesn't. Nothing's usually transmitted to the recipient when we do a cornea transplant. Good question, though. Yes. So Michigan Organ Donor Registry in general, if you're not in Michigan or not from Michigan, basically what I want you guys to know, we talked about this a little bit, it's a confidential database that can only be accessed at the time of somebody's death, and there are few people that have access to it. It's some staff at Gift of Life who are, in the field, the clinical field, and a couple of staff at the Secretary of State that may need to get in there to pull records. Doctors and nurses don't have access to this information. You can take your name off the donor registry at any time. It's not a permanent thing. You can call Gift of Life or go into the Secretary of State and ask them to remove your name. We, though, like if you sign up at the Secretary of State here in Michigan, you'll get this little heart on your license, like what you see up here. Some of you may have that. We meet a lot of people who have this on their license and don't know what it means. So if you're one of those people, now you know. It's just good to be aware that you've designated your decision to do that. If it's something you didn't mean to do, you can take your name off the registry. Or if you don't have a heart on your license, you can very easily add yourself to the donor registry. Usually if you don't have a heart on your license, it means you're not a registered organ donor. You can sign up online anytime at registerme.org. You don't need a driver's license to do that, and you don't have to have a social security number. Usually we need some sort of identifying way to tell people apart, because a lot of people have the same name and things like that. So I think on that website, they maybe use a phone number, a birth date to kind of log your information that way. So just know you don't have to sign up through the Secretary of State. You can sign up online anytime if you wish to do that. The great thing about organ and tissue donation is that we can all make an impact in this way. Literally anybody that wants to join the donor registry can. There's not a single thing that would prevent anybody from doing that. All of you in this room have the ability to sign up and make an impact. And all of you in this room could potentially benefit someday if you needed a tissue transplant, a cornea transplant, an organ transplant, right? That's the great thing. So there are no age restrictions. People of all ages can join the registry. That includes minors. Sometimes we get questions about that. There's no medical condition that would prevent you from signing up. We leave those decisions up to doctors to make at the time of your death. If your organ is healthy and they think it can be transplanted, then great. So don't let a medical condition just be the only thing that's preventing you from signing up. Same thing, sexual orientation, gender identity, there's no discrimination based on that. We have a wonderful thing called the HOPE Act here in Michigan that allows you know, people who have been living with HIV to donate their organs to people who are HIV positive. It's a really cool thing. So that, you know, whatever, you know, people have heard about blood donation, you know, certain, you know, sexuality, you know, preventing some people from donating, that does not apply here with organ transplants. So lastly, just these are some of the common things we hear from people, like reservations they have, or like these myths that are circulating out there. Okay, I have to ask you guys this. Do any of you watch Grey's Anatomy? What do you think about that? Do you think it's like highly accurate? Okay, all right, great. As long as we know that, right? Let's establish that. A lot of people get their medical information from Grey's Anatomy. I probably don't need to tell you guys that. So, or the internet. You know, we believe things we read on the internet, and I think so that sometimes plays into people's fears about organ and tissue donation. The number one fear people have is they don't want to join the registry because they don't want that little heart on their license. Their thought process is, if something happens to me, like I'm in an accident or some sort of trauma and I'm taken to a hospital, first responders and doctors are just going to let me die because they now know I'm an organ donor, so they're not going to try to save my life, so they can just take my organs. Knowing what you guys know now about how organ donation works, do you think that if somebody just let you die, that you could be a donor? Nope. Organ donation's not even medically possible unless everything has been done to save your life first. Okay, so let's just be clear on that. This just wouldn't work. Again, too, doctors, medical professionals, as you all know, take an oath to do everything they can to save your life. They are not concerned with your organ donor status, trust me. And by law, people involved in help, like first responders, doctors, nurses who help you in the hospital, by law can't be allowed to be involved in the organ donation process. Yes?
I think I'm scared of like having on my license. Okay, this is real hypothetical, but like being kidnapped and then they steal my organs, they probably would do that even if I wasn't a donor. So.
No, I mean, no, listen, I feel like I just saw you talking that through in your mind, right? Like, and your fears are, I mean, it's...
Did you hear about that thing in Chicago where they had that warehouse or whatever with a bunch of human organs in it? I know you heard about it.
I'm not as familiar with that story. So this is what I'm talking about. So there are stories out there where... No, I know. So maybe something happened, but the context may not be understood. Like, was this recently? I have to read the story about it. So, without being completely familiar with this story, there have been like warehouses, there have been places where, like, say people who've donated their body maybe for medical research or people that donate their body to science. I think that there maybe in the past has been some issues with some stories that are mixed up in that, where like organs or things that were donated for research and science. Find the story for me and I can address it a little bit better. Thank you. I guarantee you it was not organs that were being taken from people to be used for transplant. I promise. That's illegal in the United States and anywhere. No, but listen. But knowing, again, let's walk that back. Knowing what you know about organ donation, if somebody were to just steal someone's organs and put them in a warehouse, would they be able to be transplanted?
Okay, I'm sorry. It says feds raid Chicago operation linked to Detroit body parts.
Yeah, the Detroit one.
But it was in Chicago. Like it was a Chicago operation.
But it was linked to the Detroit story? Yes. It looked for me, was it, did it have something to do with like whole body donation?
It says Rosemont had freezers full of body parts in warehouses. That's another one. This one just says body parts and full body donation.
I got to look up the story again. It's not related to anything as far as organ and tissue donation goes, and I can't remember why they were there. I don't know if they were like medically discarded from different. I don't know what that was, but it didn't have anything to do with organ and tissue donation, and I should be able to better explain the difference. I need to read the story.
There's good actors and there's bad actors. And
yeah.
that's a bad actor. And
Okay,
you guys
this
don't
is
deal with
on
bad actors.
CBS Chicago.
Yeah, I'm familiar with the story, but it's just I can't remember now why those organs were there, like what it was.
Says Illinois State Task Force meets for the first time seeking to crack down on brokering of body parts, and then it talking about selling body parts to the highest bidder. It's gruesome, unregulated practice we first exposed in 2019.
I don't know how that even works, honestly. Yeah, it's not something that would happen with organ donation or tissue donation or like the hospital system. Say it again?
I said I took myself right off the list.
When you saw
I
that?
had to go get my new ID. I was like, nah.
You're like, I'm not having that. I need to look into it more, see if I can figure out how to better answer your question or address your concerns for that. Yes.
So the link she's discussing is they're randomly snatching your organs and then keeping them in a warehouse, and then how are they being placed in other bodies? Like there's just somebody disconnects in them.
I know. Well, yeah, that's the problem. I need to read the story to be fully understand what was happening there. It's certainly not something that could be used for transplant because it wouldn't be. That's the problem. You can't. I mean, it wouldn't even be viable to be transplanted. So it doesn't make sense to me. You're not.
On the black market, they might. I mean, some of them might have just went to waste, but they probably are selling some of them to people who need them right then and there, and then stuff like that can happen.
Yeah, I don't know how any of that works. Really. Yes.
What you might have mentioned this,
Yeah.
but I might have missed it. How long do those organs last once they're removed from the body?
Yeah, so we didn't talk about that. Hearts can be only be outside the body for 4 hours. Other than that, they die. They can't be transplanted. So, I mean, it literally goes from once an organ's cut off from the blood supply of a donor, the clock starts ticking. And it is flushed, it's cleaned, it's placed in a cooler or on a pump, and it goes with a transport team to the recipient, directly to the recipient. So hearts, lungs, 4 hours, liver, 8 hours. Really too long in the tissue in the organ starts to die once it's without a blood supply. So that's why I'm not quite sure what they're being, like how any of this works, like how it's being.
They have people. That's what I do. That's my theory. They have people on the black market.
It's a cadaver dealer. What is it being used for, I wonder? See, that's the problem, is the story, it gives you.
There's people that need organs and stuff. This is really my theory. I don't know if it's true. And then they reach
No, it's
out
okay.
to
We
people in the
can.
black market. They find a person. Somehow they give these people information to know that this is the right person. They kill this person. They take the organ that they need. They give it to the person that needs it. They already set up. They're ready to get the organ already. So they get this organ, and then the rest is just waste at that point.
It's interesting. I'm sure you've read stuff or heard about that. But I am not aware of that ever happening in our system of the legal system of how we do organ transplants. Our organization is not at all involved in anything like that, at all. Trust me. So if that kind of stuff is going on, I've not heard about that happening, but it's certainly not anything that would be involved in the proper way of doing organ transplants and being listed for transplant. Yes.
So I just want to, I think I heard you say this. So you said if we don't want to put the little heart on our ID, we can write a letter saying, or putting it in our will or something. Well, probably not our will, that's after we die. Writing a letter to our spouse or whoever will be point of whatever it's called, saying that I would like to donate my organs at my time of death if they are viable.
Sure, you can have advanced directives.
Yep, it's an advanced directive. You could put that in there or in your will. If you really truly want to donate, I wouldn't rely on that because it's not checked right away. You can join the organ donor registry outside of the Secretary of State. So that the registerme.org/MI is how you could join for the state of Michigan. And you won't get that hard on your license. If you want to have your name in the database when they go to check if you want to be a donor and not have that symbol on your license, that would be the way to do it. It's just through the SOS.
What if you only want to donate to children? I know I'm an adult, but I'm small, so I could probably give a kid an organ or something. What if you only want to donate to children?
You can't, you cannot say, like, all you can say is, I do or don't want to donate these organs and tissues. You cannot say, I don't want my organ to go to an adult, or I don't know why you would say you don't want your organ to go to a child, but like, you can't like state where you want them to go, unfortunately. I mean, in your case, for you, you wouldn't be able to do that. Yes, great questions, you guys. What I was referring to with writing a note is that piece of like, if you only want to donate your organs and nothing else, you would write that down in a note and sign it and date it. Because when you join the donor registry, all you're basically doing is opting into it. And it's kind of understood that you are agreeing to donate your organs, tissues, and corneas unless you legally document that somewhere else. Legal document is literally a note that you sign and date. Great questions. I like this. I like when people like are, you know, real and challenge me on things and want to know more about like, why am I hearing this story? If you're saying it works like this, right? That's important. It's important to discuss. So all major religions support donation. There's no cost. So we at Gift of Life and at Eversight, we cover the cost for organ donation to take place. So if you're a donor, your family's not going to get a bill from us for that. That's how that works. And it doesn't affect funeral arrangements. Sometimes it can extend things by maybe 24 hours. But we work very closely with funeral homes to honor whatever your wishes are. And if that's an open casket, we can do that. Yes?
Okay, you just said open casket, so you're not gonna take your face in it.
No, ma'am. However, no, listen, no. You mentioned face. I will say, I don't know if you guys have ever heard out there like people having a face transplant or an arm transplant. That's a thing. That's called a vascular composite allograft. It's pretty rare. But that is something that would require completely separate authorization from the person's family. Like there's a whole bunch of paperwork that has to be filled out. That's not covered on the donor registry. So no, generally speaking, if you're a donor, you can have absolutely have an open casket. You would never know by looking at someone that they were a donor. Yes?
So I understand that we don't charge the donor, but why do we charge the recipient?
Do you want to speak to that a little bit more? Recipients get billed by their insurance companies because...
We get billed for services rendered, just like any other
Yep,
type of
it's like
surgery.
any medical procedure.
Yeah, we don't pay for, we're not, like, when I had my surgery, I didn't pay for the organ. I paid for the time that I was in surgery, all the procedures going through. And I was blessed. Insurance basically covered all of that for me because of the way. What's that?
Were you like younger when you needed a transplant?
I was 50.
Oh.
I was 50. I was actually 49. It was 2 months before my 50th birthday. You know, but I'd struggled with autoimmune my whole life, so I always had different types of issues. Yeah, this isn't because I drank too much. So.
I didn't think so.
No.
Is there,
So yeah, so yeah, that's the reason. So yeah.
is that, there's no cost for you to be a donor, does that apply to be a living donor as well?
Living donor is like we do not facilitate that at Gift of Life
Okay,
Michigan.
that's
Living donation is
separate.
completely unrelated to the donor registry and deceased donation. However, usually, I've talked to people who've been living donors. The recipient's insurance company covers any costs associated with the living, the person who's the living donor might incur.
Okay.
I've had somebody tell me like it really costs them nothing. It may depend too on like how, if your job is good about covering your time off to be a living donor. But yes, my understanding is that the recipient's insurance company really covers that. Was that kind of how it was explained to you?
Yeah. Well, yes. Yeah, because they do the same thing for bone marrow transplants.
Yes.
and
I was
things
to
like
say,
Yep.
my dad got a random call.
Oh, yeah.
He had, somebody he knew needed a bone marrow transplant, and he signed up to be tested, didn't match with him. Couple weeks, months later, got a call that he was a match for someone else.
Wow.
And they asked if he would do it, and he obviously said, well, not obviously, but yes, he said absolutely,
Yeah.
of course. And it was at no cost
It was all covered.
to
Yeah.
him.
It pretty much works the exact same way with this. Yep. You guys have great questions and observations. Any others? Okay, I think I have one last slide for you, and then I've probably taken up way more of your time than you were planning on, so thank you for letting me talk to you guys today. I do want to leave you with this, though. It's really important that you tell somebody how you feel about this, kind of like what you were saying. Maybe you don't want that hard on your license, but you do want to be a donor. If your name is not on the donor registry, and you have it would be very rare, but you find yourself in the position to be a donor, we're going to ask your family, whoever your legal next of kin is, whether if you're married, that would be your spouse, a parent, a child. This just depends on the situation. We would ask them if they would authorize for your organs and tissues to be donated. So make sure whoever would make a decision like that for you knows, like, yes, this is what you would want to do, or nope, I don't want anything to do with this.
So does that mean every person on our event will be tested then to see if they could donate?
Every
Person who's put on a ventilator?
They'll probably be evaluated when brain death has occurred. They would be evaluated for donation, or if family members bring it up. Yep, then we would get involved, and then at that point, there's certain information we need to determine, like if somebody would even be eligible to be a donor.
So you'd only ask a family member if it was something to do with brain.
Yep.
So
Yeah,
even-
or
sorry.
nope, or if they're going to withdraw their loved one from a ventilator. Like if those cases where someone may have very limited brain function and wouldn't survive off of a ventilator. If a family's going to remove the support, then we can get involved as well if they want their loved one to be a donor. Yes, I'm sorry.
No, you're fine. Even if you're on the donor list, your family can say, like, when that's time, like, no, I don't want their.
Good question. So if you're on the donor registry and you're 18 or older, that is legally binding. So nobody can overrule your decision. Yep. So minors can join the registry too, but in those cases, yes, parent legal guardian can overrule the minor's decision to be on the registry.
Do you get a lot
Yeah.
of people that say no?
Yeah.
A lot.
That's part of the problem, I think. We have a small pool of potential organ donors to begin with, and not everybody says yes, and we respect that, and then that's it, right? So if people say yes, then we're able to work with them and explain the process to them and help them through it. We do get a lot of people that their loved one isn't registered, and they have to make that decision, and a lot of times they say yes. Well, a lot of times they say no too. So, yeah. Any other questions? Okay.
We're very thankful for the families that say yes.
We
Especially if this is
sure are, aren't we? Yes.
Well, that's for
That's
sure.
right.
Yeah, I know you are.
100%.
Yay.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming out today. Any other questions, guys, before we wrap this up? All right, let's give her a big round of applause.
Thanks all, I appreciate it. Thank you. Oh, and most importantly, please, if you want some pens, I have some AirPod covers for your AirPod cases if you have one and want one. There's bracelets, there's a bunch of free giveaways over there, so help yourself to those if you'd like them. And thank you all again for being so great. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
No problem.
Thank you.